This webinar series is a joint effort between Miami Eco Adventures, UF IFAS Extension, and Florida Sea Grant. So despite not being able to see you all in person, it's been really a pleasure for us to be able to offer this webinar series and bring you some great talks and presenters during the last year, and also just to reach a much larger and more broad audience than we normally would be accustomed to in a physical classroom. So thanks so much for tuning in today and for being a part of this program. As a quick reminder, if you can, please stay on with us today after the presentation and our Q&A, as we will be hosting an end of season conservation trivia session with an opportunity to win prizes. So the trivia questions will be based on the conservation conversation presentations that we've hosted between the month of December of last year and last month of April. Some other quick housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone in the webinar is currently muted, so we ask that you guys please remain on mute for the benefit of the audience. You can ask us any questions you may have for the presenter by typing them in the chat box. I will be moderating it throughout, so we'll make sure to get those questions answered at the end of the session. Again, the webinar is being recorded, so a link to the recording will be sent out in the next few days. We also post this video, a recording of the session on the UF IFAS Extension Miami-Dade YouTube. So that'll be up soon as well. Please follow us on social media. We will be announcing upcoming conversation topics at the beginning of the month. As a reminder, we will be taking a break for the summer, and we'll be resuming these conversations in the fall, starting in the month of September. So we're looking forward to curating some great presentations for the fall. If you'd like to get on our email list to receive reminders about these upcoming topics and the registration links, please email Anna. I will go ahead and drop that, or Anna will drop that in the chat, so you guys can email her with that or any other questions. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anna Zangroniz. She will be presenting today's conversation, The Benefits of Green and Blue Spaces. Take it away, Anna.
Thanks, Ed, and welcome everyone. Happy spring, happy summer. It sure feels like summer here in Miami-Dade County. I hope you all are healthy and well. Ed introduced me pretty warmly, but this way I'll give you a face to match my name. If we haven't met in person yet, I hope to be able to do so before the end of this year. My name is Anna Zangroniz, and I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent here in Miami-Dade County. And I feel pretty fortunate that this position allows me to spend a lot of time in both blue and green spaces. And I hope that, if maybe you haven't spent a ton of time in them thus far, that maybe things you've learned today will influence you to do so as well. We're gonna cover a lot of different vocabulary and terminology today. And then we're going to be looking specifically at 3 categories of benefits of blue and green spaces. And for our purposes, I've classified them into ecosystem services, opportunities for infrastructure, as well as health benefits. And then we will talk about some implications and opportunities for blue and green spaces. And this is a really interesting, fascinating, interesting field of study from both a natural sciences and social sciences perspective. With that, we're going to move into our first set of vocabulary. We hear a lot about being green in terms of implementing behaviors that are more sustainable or less wasteful. And so now we're going to examine the concept of green and blue in a slightly different way. And we're starting to see more mention of these ideas in mainstream media and pop culture. And here in Southeast Florida and Miami-Dade County, we have a lot of opportunities to spend time in both of these areas. First, we're going to go over specifically what green spaces are, which I suspect a lot of folks on this meeting are probably pretty familiar with. And so I want to start this by saying that we're referring specifically to natural spaces, so things that the environment created, that Mother Earth created. And one group of researchers whose papers I reviewed to put this together just define these as things like backyards, forests, gardens, and farms. And in that same realm, we have blue spaces, which again is referring to the idea of natural environments specifically those found near or along the coast. And Knutsford et al., the same group who defined green spaces, they made a very clear delineation that this is not including man-made structures or human designed and built structures. I've got a little list, a little map of Florida here. And so I wanted to highlight just a few. There are hundreds of natural spaces in the state. I want to say that this is not to scale, nor is this a comprehensive list. And as these arrows and names populate on the slide in front of you, I'd just like to ask you to take notice of the different management agencies which are in charge of these different areas. We have the federal agency management, which they oversee things like national parks and forests and national wildlife refuges and seashores. And then we have state management, which is in charge of state parks and aquatic preserves. And we also have NARES, or National Estuarine Research Reserves, which here in Florida are a federal state partnership. And then there are also other managed areas by local governments. And as an example, I listed Crandon Park, which is part of Miami-Dade County Parks and Rec here in our county. And although a lot of these spaces exist now more in a fragmented way rather than a connected or undisturbed area, they're still extremely critical in the various services and benefits that they provide. Looking through all of these different cooks in the kitchen, if you will, I wanted to pull up the different mission statements from the 3 tiers of government, at least as the tiers of government being federal government, state government, and Miami-Dade counties. And so if you don't necessarily have to read through all of these, but at least look at the boldened words. There's a lot of common threads in the 3 missions, and that's protecting or preserving the unimpaired or natural areas and cultural areas or experiences, all with this idea of preserving them for future generations. So there's a lot of crossover between the mission statements, even though they're coming from different levels of government management. They're really critical, and we have a pretty amazing system at all different levels here in the state and in the US. So to get us started with our first topic, I'm going to ask Ed to launch a poll. You guys should see a poll pop up on your screen very shortly. And the poll is simply asking, what are ecosystem services? So please use your mouse to select your answer and then hit submit. This is anonymous, so please don't feel worried about choosing the right or wrong answer. This is just to see where everybody is currently starting from. So are these A, services that the ecosystem benefits from? B, services that the ecosystem provides to the organisms that inhabit it? C, the positive benefit that wildlife or ecosystems provide to people? Or D, the positive benefit that ecosystems provide to its wildlife? We'll give it maybe 20 or 30 more seconds, and we'll ask Ed to end the poll and share the results. I see lots of different answers coming in, so this is good. There's a whole wide range of understanding when it comes to this topic. So I'm really glad that we're starting with this one.
All right, I'll give it a couple more seconds. I think we're almost to 15. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that.
Awesome. And Ed, can you share the results for a second, please? They're almost, if you guys can see this, they're almost pretty close along the board. And so for those of you who chose, let's see if I can get my slide to change, chose answer C, that was the correct answer, and which is the positive benefit that wildlife or ecosystems provide to people. Good job, everyone. I'm glad we started with that. I know it's still before lunch, so feel free to grab a snack and get your brain going. I want to review a couple of definitions when it comes to ecosystem services. The first is one that came from a paper by Boyd and Bonzoff in 2007. And it's essentially that ecosystem services are defined as very simply the benefits of nature to households, communities, and economies. And I like that definition, but particularly when viewed next to this definition, that's a little bit more intensive. This is from the National Wildlife Foundation, and that's any positive benefit that wildlife or ecosystems provide to people, whether they are direct or indirect, small or large. And what's really important and slightly different about this definition is that it denotes that human beings do not pay for these services. And after studying this concept in graduate school and talking about it and teaching about it through my various positions, I never really stopped to consider it from that perspective. And I thought that was important to mention. Ecosystem services, whether on land or underwater, are generally categorized into these four groups: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural. And within those groups, to give you a little bit more idea, more examples, within a provisioning, we're talking providing items or sustenance, raw materials that we can use for different purposes, energy, medicinal resources. Here in Florida, really important, water. Regulating includes cleaning and purification services that happen with air and water, storing or carbon sequestration, regulation of the ability to regulate climate, biological pest control. And these are also not the full list within each category. So I hope maybe this tantalizes you to do a little bit more research and learn more. And then things like supporting, which some scientists argue that this also crosses into or bleeds into that regulating category a little bit, but providing or creating habitat, the process of primary production, soil formation, and nutrient cycling. Then lastly, that cultural category, which falls more into, it encompasses more of the, not only the recreational or aesthetic services provided by these areas, but also things like research and education and scientific information. It was really tempting to pull up every wonderful infographic about ecosystem services, but I restrained myself because, you know, I have to give you guys homework. There has to be more for you to do once you leave here. But I think that this example that's put together by the Ocean Conservancy does a really strong job for what just some of the coastal or marine ecosystems that we have in Florida, the benefits that they provide. And that's specifically referring to what we are most vulnerable to come August and September, and that's hurricanes. And all of these systems, noted that not every system is found in every part of the state, but coral reefs for Southeast Florida in particular are incredibly valuable because they are our very first natural line of defense against major storm action. Not only do they reduce wave height and wave energy, they also reduce the intensity of flooding and erosion once those waves reach the shore. Something that is not reflected by this particular infographic are also the impact that seagrasses have. So if you were to think about a cross section looking from land moving out to water, here in Miami-Dade County, we would have mangroves and then seagrasses and then coral reefs all the way out in the ocean. And those seagrasses play a vital role in improvement of water quality, as well as their root system, their rhizomes stabilize the sediments, which also helps control erosion. And they also serve other cool ecosystem functions. But again, this is just to whet your appetite. Don't get way too much into this particular presentation, but there are economic implications from healthy, thriving blue and green spaces here in South Florida. In Florida, we have over 1,300 miles of coastline. And in addition to coastline, we have 7,800 lakes and 12,000 miles of rivers and streams. And so considering that tourism is a major economic driver here, tourists don't want to visit Florida and visit yucky beaches. They don't want to visit beaches that aren't clean, that aren't functional. They want white sandy beaches. I would like to note that every year during our most busy spring break season, the city of Miami Beach partners with Miami-Dade County to provide or to work out constant cleaning and management of the beaches so that every day when those tourists go to bed, come and wake up to a clean beach once again. So it's a pretty intense amount of work that they provide. And so not only does that keep the tourists happy, but less debris and waste entering the beaches, of course, is really good as well. Oh, I think that just clicked early. Sorry about that. But in Florida, a study that came out in 2018 reflected that in the state of Florida, there was about $112 billion spent in tourism-related expenses in the year 2016. And the Florida Fish and Wildlife, or FWC, estimates that of that amount, almost $8 billion comes specifically from tourists who are looking to engage in outdoor activities. I want to move now into our second category of green and blue space benefits, and that's the opportunity for changes or improvements to various aspects of infrastructure. And green and blue infrastructure, or GBI, is a strategy that's being employed in lots of different areas around the world as an opportunity to reduce vulnerability to various threats, namely stressors that are coming as a result of global climate change, including heat pollution, water shortages, and flooding. And so in this example is this concept of green roofs, which is something that's getting a little bit more attention in, like I mentioned, mainstream media. And this provides an opportunity. Instead of a traditional black or gray roof, this is essentially where that roof has been retrofitted to contain or feature softer plants, foliage, shrubs, etc. Obviously, this has to be very carefully planned and designed. It can't just be go throw all of your spider plants and orchids on the roof. That's not likely going to result in the benefits that you're hoping to achieve, but there are multiple benefits that can be gained from employing green roofs, particularly on things like commercial clusters of buildings or, commercial businesses. This is an aerial shot of the University of Miami's Coral Gables campus, and this is a series of buildings that was just retrofitted with these green roofs, and it was a project that involves several of their local schools, like the School of Architecture. And so there are lots of environmental benefits to be gained from green roofs, and it's been found that they have a longer lifespan than traditional roof material. The next opportunity for infrastructure that I wanted to bring up is the concept of rain barrels. And so we're going to group this loosely into that idea of a blue space, and that's, I say blue space with some air quotes around that. But this is an opportunity. This is essentially collection of rainwater in a containment device at your home. And there are so many benefits to be had from this. And namely, I mean, there's a lot, but namely, this reduces the amount of stormwater that can run off your house, run down your driveway, pick up other pollutants or contaminants and send them into our stormwater system. And this also can reduce some of the stress or pressure from rainwater that collects or falls around your house. And it provides a lot of freedom from having to, well, everyone has to comply to restrictions as they're implemented during low water times, but this also reduces pressure on our drinking water supply, because if you're able to collect water in a rain barrel, you can use that for irrigation and other purposes instead of necessarily needing to lean on turning on your tap all the time. And so this is a program that is administered and taught through UF IFAS Extension's Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And I'm going to ask Ed to put a link in the chat for upcoming rain barrel workshops. There are online programs that correspond with, if you want to have a rain barrel in your house, there is a drive-by pickup session available. And these are usually the drive-by pickup sessions, for the most part, happen at our main extension office in Homestead. But I believe my friend and colleague Barbara is on, and I'll also ask her to put her email into the chat, because she is one of our fabulous representatives of this program and will be able to give you all of the information you could possibly want about this program and more. The final opportunity when it comes to infrastructure is the design and implementation of pervious pavements, or pavements that allow for water to flow through them and saturate and absorb into the soil and be clean before it reaches our aquifer. These pervious or softer pavements also allow for less heat buildup. And if there's less heat buildup, we're also saving money in terms of not needing to incur as much cooling costs. And overall reduction of temperature, for many reasons, is incredibly important for trying to become more resilient as we move forward in our world that is facing many aspects of global climate change. Now, one of the studies I read it gave me I had another little aha moment. And that was this idea presented by Sandifer and Sutton Greer, where they introduced the concept of human health as the ultimate ecosystem service. So again, this was a little head explosion to me, because I always associated ecosystem services with hurricane protection and flooding control, et cetera, but I never thought of it from that perspective. And this idea ties right into the final aspect of green and blue space benefits. So briefly, there's unbelievable amounts of information about this subject. Interestingly, the majority of the literature that exists is specifically in respect to the benefits of green spaces or more terrestrial spaces than what has already been studied or what is available about blue spaces or ocean and coastal system spaces. The majority of these studies are conducted in two ways, and that's a cross-sectional study versus a longitudinal study. And I'll also say that the majority of these are also done from a more social science approach rather than natural sciences approach. And the main differences between these two studies is that a cross-sectional study is looking at some variables at a single point in time. So essentially a snapshot in time that is involving many people and examining various relationships between the people and whatever variables. And that's a little bit different than the longitudinal study that might examine one individual and a single variable, but over the course of several years. When I first heard the term longitudinal study, I thought it meant that they were looking at people who lived at different longitudes, or east to west, throughout a geographic area. So slightly different definition than what I thought. From a physical benefits perspective, studies conducted in Australia show that people who live closer to the coast are more likely to meet recommended levels of activity. And interestingly, the levels of activity that are met are overwhelmingly higher for women than men. So it seems, at least in Australia, that more women are doing their required or recommended amounts of exercise when they are living closer to the coast. Sorry, I've lost my mouse. I don't know what's happening. Okay, here we go. And a study that came out fairly recently by Tan et al. Suggests that the type of the green or blue space might strongly influence the prevalence and type of physical exercise. And this came from a study they conducted with about 1,500 people in Singapore and found that of the people who participated, 90% exercised outdoors, 73% walked in about 30-minute segments, 46% did individual-based activities, and 12% did team sports. And I created this little Venn diagram to try and just give ideas or suggestions of some of what those included within the study. Group activities simply reflect activities where you must have more than one person to engage in said activity. For example, Frisbee, versus all of the individual activities arguably could be performed alone or in the company of other people. Overall, within this study, more people conducted more exercise in greater amounts of blue space, but the opposite was true when tree cover is high. And that's due to this idea where if there's a very heavy tree or canopy cover, it was very likely that there was fear associated with that, less visibility, and with the perhaps possibility that a crime could occur. And exercise frequency increased when people lived within 1.5 kilometers to that green or blue space. These are a couple of examples that I unearthed after a very quick Google search of articles that have been read reflecting the benefits associated with greener blue spaces on mental and emotional health. And that's what we're going to talk about next. This was a really interesting set of results from a bunch of different studies that I looked at. So the summary, some of the major key takeaways, because I read lots of papers, but overall, the results of what I researched were overwhelmingly positive. So this might be breaking news for some of you. For some of you, this might seem like common sense, but overwhelmingly, blue and green spaces showed the potential to promote positive health and prevent poor health. The idea of residential greenness, or people who in their personal home or properties had green spaces, showed lower odds of depression and overall poor health. Walking in green spaces was correlated with positive effects on mood. If individuals own property with an open view, they had lower health risks associated with that. Urban green spaces versus just an urban or more built gray environment, positive moods increased and negative moods decreased. Something that I thought was really interesting was this newer concept of prescriptions to nature to improve. This is prescriptions by doctors to exposure to nature. So that's something I think is pretty interesting and moving forward, especially when we consider how our healthcare system in the United States. And one paper in particular found that there were more positive mental health benefits gained by individuals who spent time in marine ecosystems, but specifically those that showed a higher level of biodiversity. So the more healthy and functioning that marine ecosystem, the higher level of mental health benefit. In their 2016 paper, Knutsford et al. Identified 3 direct causal pathways that may directly or indirectly affect mental health. The first was the idea of if there is blue space available, it increases the likelihood of engaging in physical activity, which would therefore lead to improved mental health. Also, that blue space can facilitate more and higher levels of social interaction. And finally, that blue space can result in positive mental health benefits. And this was showing especially positive impact on wanted to transition for a moment, and especially in the light that we are over a year into this pandemic, and while things are starting to improve, there are going to be very long-term repercussions when it comes to the changes that we have faced in this country over the past year and change. And in the United States alone, about 20% of the adult population live with some sort of mental illness, whether it be those that are categorized as, quote, less severe, things like lower level anxiety or depression disorders, to more severe disorders or illnesses that require higher levels of patient care and medication. Here in Florida, we have a pretty significant subset of the population that are struggling with severe mental illness. So of the two descriptions that I mentioned a moment ago, those that are struggling with the latter, those severe mental illnesses that require pretty intensive care and usually prescribed medication. And about half of the population in this state will be struggling with some sort of mental illness. However, despite that, out of 50 states, Florida ranks 43rd when it comes to the availability of mental health programs, which I find to be a pretty staggering and, frankly, disappointing statistic. Specifically, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic that we have been in for over a year now, this is a figure of adults who self-reported symptoms of anxiety or depression. And this column here on the bar graph on the left shows that from January through June of 2019, this was those who chose to participate. It was only about 11% of the population, versus January 2021, so just a few months ago, 41% of the population in the United States self-reported symptoms of anxiety and or depression. So these are implications that we really need to consider moving forward as the pandemic hopefully starts to, I don't want to say fade into the background, but we start moving into our new normal and start to figure out other ways that we can address this and improvements overall within the mental health care system and looking to other strategies. And I bring that up because some of these papers that I looked at were asking the question of how can we bottle the effects, the positive effects of blue or green spaces, or make them more accessible to people? How can we bring these effects to the people? And this is a screenshot from Grey's Anatomy. I am still watching this show, 17 seasons in. I'm not giving up yet. And it's an example of this green space that was installed in their hospital as a little getaway to de-stress the doctors. And yes, this is an example from a TV show, and not all TV shows are real, but there are examples, and they are being referenced in the literature, of doctors and hospitals that are trying to emulate this and create green or blue spaces, not only for the purpose, the positive benefit to their staff, but also to reduce anxiety in patients, which I think is pretty fantastic. More locally, here in the US, something that is another real example is that for their centennial celebration, the National Park Service started an initiative to get every fourth grader into a park. And here in Miami-Dade County, the Biscayne National Park Institute has received grant funding to bring farm workers' families out to the park and get them on a boat to see the park. So there are initiatives at more local levels to try and get people exposed to their local blue and green spaces. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that not all of this will be easy, but there are challenges associated with trying to get people in and to their spaces. And one of those challenges is distance. It can be tough, particularly when you consider physical access, costs associated, whether it be through cost of public transit, lack of public transit, tolls, parking, etc. Weather is a factor as well. We're getting to the point of the year where I try not to spend any time outdoors except to run to and from my car if it's daylight. So that does have to be considered, because that is certainly can affect how or where people spend time outdoors. There are also effects that come with major storms. So if I'm knocking on wood over here, I'm knocking on my forehead. If we have a major storm event, there is not only physical cleanup and recovery from that, but there can also be negative health aspects associated with post-storm aftershocks, if you will. And of course, social economic equity in planning or redevelopment of these spaces, making sure that all members of the community are consulted with, received input from, et cetera. In as a lot of these cities, Miami-Dade County and city of Miami included, move forward in brainstorming how we're going to be making improvements. Very quickly, I want to just make note that the majority of the studies reviewed for this talk today came from the United Kingdom, Asia, and Australia and New Zealand. And only 3 of the studies that I could find reflected blue and green spaces in the United States. One was Ohio, the other was the Great Lakes, and the other was Seattle. And so it's very possible that a lot of the research when it comes to natural areas or green and blue spaces and physical exercise has been constrained due either seasonality or cooler temperatures. That maybe could explain why there's not as much data from the United States. But I think in looking at this, we Miami-Dade, the US, we have a great opportunity to learn, not only to learn more about what these spaces do for people, but also to help continuing to inform conservation and preservation, and also the resiliency of ecosystems and our communities. And these can really help when it comes to informing management, future management, and policy decisions. Wanted to wrap up by giving a few examples of really cool urban, green, and eventually blue spaces. And the first is the High Line, which is in New York City. And it's a public park built on a historic freight rail line that's elevated above the streets on the west side of the island of Manhattan. And it opened in 2009 as a hybrid public space that was designed to promote nature, art, and design. And it's a really cool space. I have been there. It is open right now, and on the weekends just requires a reservation, is to try and keep folks separate. Here in Miami, we have the Underline, which is a cool project that is essentially repurposing and redesigning the M path, or the footpath or bike path that runs under the metro rail. And if you look at the map on the left of your screen, it starts in downtown Miami and extends about 10 miles away, all the way down to the Dadeland area. And very similarly, these are being used as public spaces to encourage recreation and, travel and enjoyment. The last component of this that I wanted to mention is the Miami-Dade County Parks, Recreation, and Open Spaces Open Space Master Plan, which is a 50-year vision of creating a seamless and sustainable parks and open space system in Miami-Dade County, connecting federal, state, and local parks. And one of the goals of this is to allow the county to grow in a more livable and sustainable way. And the part that really resonates with me is that one of the major goals in this plan is so that every resident can walk 5 minutes and get to a park or community green space, which I think is really fantastic. Another component or aspect of the Open Space Master Plan is a smaller subset called the WRAP, or Water Recreation Access Plan. And that's essentially to connect the blue and green spaces in the county. We're looking to create a seamless water trail, a blueway system. And so public input has already been gathered. and I can provide you more information to that, but they've done the county has already done a bunch of public scoping meetings to start getting input from recreational users of these areas. And all of these things, including the last part, which is probably the newest project, the Ludlam Trail project, which is to create another connected area, a loop, part of the Miami Loop project, along very close to Southwest 67th Avenue or Ludlam Road, along very close to the railroad tracks that are here, and which is going to be a stretch of area that is connected green space that will allow pedestrians and cyclists to be able to use this green space and avoid some of the high traffic congestion areas. So I think it would be really awesome if the development and incorporation of all of these different plans, we somehow figure out a way to insist upon or secure funding or mechanisms for studying the different effects and not just tally usage numbers on a daily basis. Any of you guys are interested in any of the material that I looked at, I'm happy to send you some of these papers, so just let me know. And with that, I'm going to ask Ed to launch our final poll. It's a really easy poll, and it's simply for us to be able to capture some demographic information about the webinar today. And I'll read these questions aloud. And again, please just use your mouse to make your selection. Number 1, please indicate your level of agreement with the following. I learned something from participating in this webinar. Strongly agree means you learned a lot. Agree means you learned something. Disagree means you did not learn anything new. Question number 2, I'm simply looking for how many people in your home, in front of your device, are watching the webinar. I don't want you to try and divine the number of people present on the participants list. This is just who in real time is watching the webinar. Is it just yourself? Do you have someone else with you? And then finally, where are you watching this webinar from? Are you in Miami-Dade County, outside of Florida, somewhere else in the States, or elsewhere on the planet? And we'll let folks finish that up. You can leave that poll open for another second. And as I close, I wanted to leave you all with this image that a friend of mine sent to me. They saw online. I found it. I pulled it from Twitter. And they're very similar. There's many similar designs of this, if you will, but I thought this was really poignant and it struck me, and thought it was a nice way to close with this idea of our planet having 2 major mechanisms that it receives air, one being the blue or the ocean, and the other being green or the forests. So I thought that was really pretty, and you can find it on Twitter as well, or if you just Google "our planet has 2 lungs," you'll find it. But I thought this was really nice and appropriate to our conversation today. So with that, I want to thank you all for your patience and listening, and please stick around for question and answer, and then we're going to play our trivia game.